moral concern, integrity, and love. They're seeing nothing sensational, opportunistic, or insincere about it. It seemed like challenging to do, but also a pleasure to do, and making the audience, part of a show felt like profoundly democratic and generous. And there was something sort of cathartic and inspiring, particularly at the end as you read everybody's little, dreams and visions. So I feel like in vibration with the spirit of this whole thing, and then feel a kinship with you all as somebody who spent many years of my life researching this and swum in the same waters, walked through, the same bramble to try to do my own thing. In terms of my own motivations, I came of age in the 80s after the world war started. And then was involved in the great social struggles of my own day, which was to throw CI recruiters off campus, have your university divest from South Africa, prevent the ground war in Latin America. And then in very conscious ways, my cohort looked at the campus activists of the 60s as their forebears, who established a kind of moral vocabulary and articulation of struggle that we felt we were participating in some sense extending into a new context and into new times. And in a sort of selfish way, I wanted to do a kind of genealogy of my own belief system to try to understand the origins of my own worldview. In the 60s, they made a look back to the labor activists of the 30s, and then the 60s were sort of directly inspirational for my generation because we were just one little generation removed. And then the basic frame of reference was sort of new left, anti-imperialist, sort of civil rights, not so much anarchist as you have today. And then secondly, in Reagan's America, I felt myself in kind of like a state of war, okay, as we fought against militarism, the demobilization of the welfare state. But it was largely a symbolic war, fought by means of the ballot box, demonstrations, some direct action, petitioning, marching, and this whole sort of civic toolkit. But violence wasn't really a part of it. And then I was curious, if you take a kind of logic of irreconcilable ideological conflict to its furthest extreme, you end up in a state of literal war. And then not too many years before me, just 15 years before me, people similarly educated, similar background, similar value system brought themselves to that point of feeling that it was necessary and just to launch a literal civil war. And then they had sort of deluded themselves into believing that such a war was, winnable. So I was interested of, when does, political conflict become militarized, and what happens when that happens, to your own cause. What can you advance and what can you harm by, picking up the gun in the name of justice. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think societies are much more interesting in times of crisis than times of consensus. Okay, when everything is up for grabs, nothing is sacred or settled. And the 60s was a period of crisis par excellence with the nature of the American state, race relations, sex, sexuality, family, drugs, consciousness, everything was being, radically questioned. So intellectually, it was very, interesting to study. And I think that the Weather Underground Black Panthers were really emanations of the unsolved problems of racism, inequality, and militarism. And then that piece of the 60s story, in the 80s at least, wasn't told so often. We tended to focus on Martin Luther King and, early civil rights movement and SDS and participatory democracy and all these things that feel sort of patriotic and Jeffersonian, deeply American. But there had been a kind of conspiracy of silence about the latter part of the decade. And my notion is that we sort of avoid understanding that history at our own peril because racism, war, militarism, and inequality persist. And if we don't confront in a serious way these problems, we could have the kinds of turmoil and social explosions of the 60s in a sort of chaotic and unguided way in which a lot of people could, get hurt very, very badly. So that's the answer to your question.
How well do you think the Weather Underground's analysis of what was going on in American society holds up? Specifically this idea that, I guess they got it maybe from certain black activists and black thinkers potentially, but this idea that there's something really similar going on in abroad to what's going on at home in terms of exploiting people abroad in a sort of imperialistic way and exploiting people at home who have maybe limited economic and social rights.
I mean, I think they're like moral instincts to be outraged at exploitation and inequality were right on. But they think they had, by the end, an incredibly cartoonish worldview. where the world was divided into imperial suppressor, evil people, and heroic, third world, wretched of the earth, sort of rising up in resistance. And they ended up with like an incredibly Manichaean, dichotomized worldview, where you're part of the solution or you're part of the problem. So you're not picking up a gun to try to take down the American state, then you're objectively counter-revolutioning yourself, perpetuating a kind of violence. Like, it's very harsh to say in the midst of a crisis like in the 60s, if you're doing nothing, you're on the side of the pigs. Like, what about the poor woman in Kansas who's watching her television, confused about the world, doesn't really understand what's going on? Her husband was in war. Is she perpetrating violence, like sitting in her, living room? So I understand the notion that, the times were kind of morally urgent and people were called to take a stand. But they had, by the end of their sort of first phase, a sense that there was, one way to be truly dedicated to, the sort of cause of justice, freedom, and equality, and it ended up being incredibly restrictive. And I think you captured that very well in the play, where they're sort of trapped in a kind of agony of their own making. They can't speak in sentences, but only in slogans. They're yelling at each other all the time, and then they sort of want to birth a new world, but like don't know how to do it or how to get enough people on their side to give themselves much of a chance. And then we're black, sort of a kind of internal colony in the United States. You could make that argument, but they had this sense that anti-imperialism, such as was waged in Vietnam or Latin America or in Asia, could be sort of transplanted into the domestic context with little modification or variation. That it was the same struggle everywhere that could be successfully fought everywhere by the same means, and that turned out to be a catastrophic misunderstanding of American society.
One of the things that really struck us about the Weathermen is how quickly they alienated so many potential supporters. Because SDS, Students for Democratic Society, at its height was about 100,000 members. And within, it's a little more complicated than this, but within the course of about a year, tens of thousands of those people had certainly dropped out of SDS, and in many cases dropped out of the movement. Partly, I would say, because of the confrontationalism of the Weathermen. On the other hand, sometimes confronting the system is important. It's important to call attention in an immediate and passionate way to what's going wrong. So I'm curious, especially in your experience as an activist, how do you figure out what kind of confrontations are impactful and make a difference, and what kind of confrontations are going to leave people screaming for the hills?
Right. And there's sort of a lot in your question, starting with the Weathermen first. Like at their most dogmatic phase, the notion is either you're down with what they're doing, or you are a white supremacist apologist or imperialist, no better than a pig. So if you didn't join them, it was your problem, not theirs.
Right.
And then they saw themselves as, the words of one of them whom I interviewed, the handful of race traitors in the United States. White people who took this position of radical solidarity with the most militant elements of, the black movement. So their own failure could be rationalized as a failure of insight, courage, and conviction in all the people who, stayed away. And that was a very, very, very debilitating view to have. And they tried to correct for it later, be more inclusive, actually sort of reach out to people and speak in a language that they could get with. But again, at their most, dogmatic, they were sort of profoundly exclusionary, and they positioned themselves as a kind of revolutionary elect. And then you captured that aspect, I think, very nicely, particularly the scene that was taking place up here, where the guy has second thoughts about the Brinks thing, and she says, you're a coward, you never believed this all along, you're, worse than useless, you're a piece of dirt, whatever. And then that was a kind of, perverse mentality that I think, cost them an enormous amount. And then, I believe that militancy can be, very, very compelling in moral and existential terms, and it can be very effective in political terms. And there was a massive range of militant activism in the 60s, and then, bombing things is part of the spectrum, but the spectrum includes, burning draft files from draft offices, or lying down in front of troop trains, or even disabling war material before it gets to Vietnam, or taking over, the campus buildings, or breaking the windows in a military research center, whatever. And then there were like lots and lots of ways to do something, bold, demonstrative, in which objectively crippled the ability of the system to conduct the business of war. And then I think that, one should sort of studiously examine what are ways that people can creatively make sort of righteous trouble. And in that study, ask yourself, what are you helping and what are you harming with any given, tactic, act, or stunt. And then there's an enormous amount that you can do short of violence. And then one example of something that I thought was really cool, like the group that I'm part of, we actually shut down the Supreme Court in 2007 for about 2 hours, which is not easy to do. And this was on one of the anniversaries of the opening of Guantanamo, January 11th, and then 80 of us got arrested, 40 of us inside, 40 of us outside. And then instead of giving our own names to the police, we gave the names of detainees. And then we were officially arrested as the detainees, put into the court record as detainees, and some of us stood trial. Never saying our own name, saying I'm here on behalf of so-and-so, so-and-so. And the idea was to give the detainees symbolically the day in court that the U.S. government had deprived them because they had no, habeas rights.
Right.
So it's militant, it's confrontational, it got a fair amount of media, especially overseas. The detainees, through lawyers, heard about it and thanked us for it in letters that the Navy confiscated. And it has a kind of, moral resonance.
Yeah.
Okay? And then my favorite one for the whole 60s was the Catonsville Mine. Do people know what that is? Okay.
Go ahead.
9 Catholics, led by Daniel and Philip Berrigan, both priests, but a number of other people participated, raided a draft court office in Catonsville, Maryland, took the 1A files, which are the files designating people for service in Vietnam, went to a parking lot and then used a homemade napalm that they had devised out of a military manual and burnt the files. So there were sort of burning pieces of paper that literally signified the deaths of women and children in Vietnam and the deaths of American soldiers, insofar as that piece of paper was part of the ticket, for a soldier overseas. So that's what I call like an act of moral genius, where the morality of what you're doing is embedded in the act itself.
Yeah.
And they stood in a circle, they prayed, they were captured, there was a trial, it became a play that a lot of what political actors know a lot about, and then it speaks to us 40 years later because of how sort of profound it was and how beautifully the whole sort of pageant of their testimony in court was captured by Daniel Berrigan, and I recommend people check it out, and especially people involved in this production, look at it and maybe consider doing it. It's really, really, really intense. So I'm pro militancy, but anti-violence, and then a lot of people have a hard time with that.
I want to open it up to the audience if anybody has
sure.
questions.
I was just reading through Kathy Wilkerson's memoir,
Right.
and she actually shouts out that event and says how amazing their restraint was,
Right.
that they had such a focus and did something so simple and so powerful and poetic, and that at the time when that happened, she remembers being like, fuck those guys, they didn't really do anything, but now looking back on it, she's really moved by their thing. And there's probably a question in there somewhere, but I'm mostly just proud of myself for reading a book.
Students are right.
I guess something that being in this play is interesting because I have to make my brain crazy, you know what I mean? I have to really click into a universe where yes, this is obviously the way things work, and I think Days of Rage is something that I'm still really grappling with. Every time I think about it again, I'm oh, that's crazy that they had so many people agree to come and then they were disappointed so profoundly. I guess Someone help me think of
Well, I
a
have a
question.
question related to that.
The same things that
Because
are interesting.
one thing I thought was really striking in your book was, I wanted to address this too, so I'll let you talk about it. But, it was what you said about how the weathermen didn't necessarily see people not flocking to their side as a cause for despair, that their own intensity was a kind of victory in itself. You know what I'm talking about?
Sure.
Right.
I mean, again, you guys ask very sort of complicated questions. I mean,
Question.
and then another neat thing about the Catonsville thing is that the perpetrators of this righteous act, did no moral damage to themselves.
Right.
Right? And then they all look back with a tremendous sense of pride and satisfaction. Some of them having, been in federal prison for it, and Jeremy Varon was underground, years for this, and contrast that with the weathermen, who to varying degrees, remain haunted by some of what they did or planned to do and didn't do. I mean, they were a crossed wire away from committing an act of murder, albeit for political reasons, but an act of murder. And then for me, the most profound part of this whole thing is, if you think about it, the most audacious political act you can do is to claim the right to kill another human being on the basis of an ideal, nation, justice, whatever. And then, what does it take to get yourself to the point where you claim, for reasons of ideology, morality, the right to kill? And most of us, never confront that directly in our lives, unless you're a soldier and then you're told to kill, somebody else's idea. But they confronted that, and that's a really sort of profound and heavy thing that I think the play, captured. But you can do a lot of, you can hurt other people and you can hurt yourself. And Robert Roth, very militant member of the group, said, it's a tragedy that we lost 3 of our own in the townhouse, but it would have been an even bigger tragedy if they had succeeded in what they were doing. And that's a really heavy thing for a revolutionary to admit. 3 of his friends died. And then, with the Days of Rage, as somebody analyzed it, you can't organize white people around dying. That would go to high schools and say, come to Chicago and have the police crack your head. And it's not very sexy or appealing. And then, from their own standpoint, they were sort of steeling themselves, for combat. And even if they were routed militarily, what they accomplished is they said they were going to do something ballsy, and they did. And then the world didn't think they would pull it off, and they didn't think they would pull it off. So they could emerge from that saying, we have proven our mettle, we've demonstrated our commitment. But every step along the way, they would lose people. We're like, I'm off this train because we're headed for jail or death. Every step along the way. By the end, there are just, a few dozen. By the mid-70s, there were maybe 39 underground fugitives from the weathermen. And then some of them weren't even wanted on any charges, but they were so sort of addicted to underground life and identified with it so strongly they didn't know how to surface and be themselves anymore. So it got all very sort of existential and confusing. But the numbers we're talking are, tiny. And the sort of casus belli, the cause for war, the Black Liberation Army might be more compelling given slavery and white supremacy, but they too are a handful of people. And then, the question is, can a tiny handful of people in a country of then, 200 million, claim that you're in a state of war and then rationalize casualties like the Bringstar as collateral damage, as happens in any war? And then from the mindset of the people in prison and who defended that, that's the perspective. The injustice of American empire was so great that it was just to attack it by means of war, and it's tragic that people die, but they die in any war. They're prisoners of war, and if you believe in, the core integrity of the cause, you have to somehow be okay with the deaths of the people they killed. And I don't know that I can quite make that leap because the scale was so puny. What if you have a war and nobody shows up? And then, by the 80s, it was kind of like that. So you had a handful of diehards at the end. Again, you with some historical modifications, captured it, very well. And for some of them, this is everything that they thought they could do. They reinvented themselves as revolutionaries, and it was incredibly, incredibly hard to break with that kick, because it meant they were, just another white person on this island.
What was the best case scenario for the bomb going in Portland? It was going to go off, and then other people would build other bombs, and oh, I'm so sorry, they're okay.
No.
Right. Yeah.
First off, they kept it a secret for years.
Yeah.
And then I kind of operational details, like, I don't really know, but you can imagine that would have killed non-commissioned officers and their gates. So like some poor, girl from New Jersey with like thick hair and lipstick, like, is she a legitimate target? You could argue plausibly soldiers destined for Vietnam are, a uniform enemy, but the point of which you're talking about the dates of, 19-year-old simply frightened boys, like, what are you talking about? And then, that's kind of, and then if that had happened, then the government may have gone nuts and just rounded people up with little evidence, possibly assassinated some of them. I mean, it's, a lot hinged on one little cross wire. For me, I made a huge thing in my book about how there was a kind of moral awakening in the wake of that. And you guys kind of downplayed it in the play. I mean, they had an ideological struggle that you represented viscerally and kinetically, which I thought was an interesting dramatical choice. And then you kind of jump cut to, like a montage of like all of their bombings, but they made a conscious decision not to harm human beings.
Yeah.
And then that was an enormous moment in their narrative. And then in my mind, like, one of the best things they did was stop where they did. The Germans didn't. I studied them thoroughly, and they became murderers many, many times over. There were dozens of them in prison, and the whole thing became this agonizing, very German, tragedy. It was like a refraction of the trauma of the Nazi period.
You mean the Red Army?
The Red Army faction, sure.
Bader-Meinhof.
Bader-Meinhof, yeah. I studied that.
That's in the book too?
That's in
You
the
put
book,
all
too.
these people in the same book?
Put them all in the same book. Very hard to do. Imagine doing this play. and having
Because
it-
you said they're different.
Yeah. Whatever. I mean, so I studied two armed struggles whose origins were almost identical, but went in very, 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 very different trajectories. And most in the Weather Underground pulled back. The Germans just kept going further, and it became this like whole other thing. There's a mountain of literature on the German struggle. My book's a good place to start, but not the first and last word. So other responses or comments? I'm curious from the audience. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Did you say the Germans kept going further?
Yes.
Bader-Meinhof and
Yes.
also the Italian
Yes.
Red Brigades. But, in terms of, you spend a lot of time about, the ordinary victims or innocent victims or whatever. But in fact, the European groups really targeted people that they saw as the pillars of this totally unjust system. In many cases, people who had collaborated with the Nazis in Germany, etc. So they targeted top businessmen, political, military political leaders, etc. And they also continued apparently to draw new recruits as their ranks were depleted. But in the end, the society was able to defend against and polarized against them just as easily. I mean, it took longer because the Germans had this sort of guilt hanging over them, so they had the society wasn't as easily sort of militarized against it. But I just wonder how you said you've compared them. I mean, their strategy was very different. At the end, they may have ended up being just as bloody-minded and sort of not non-specific as the Weathermen, but in the beginning at least they had something of a strategic target, and they understood that the West German regime was still permeated with Nazis, basically, or Nazi sympathizers.
That's an extremely cogent summary. Like everything you said is like dead on. No, really, it's not easy to do. I mean, sure, they had a strategic vision and, model as an urban guerrilla, war, but their ostensible goal was to create socialist revolution in Germany. And then over time, it became pretty apparent that this means of struggle wasn't going to deliver the kind of social transformation they sought. And you could wonder, well, then why go on? And there's a famous German radical, this guy Hans-Joachim Klein, Carlos the Jackal, was part of the OPEC takeover in 1974, and he said in an interview by a French newspaper in 1981, we were unlike the Weathermen of saying, okay, now we stop. And a lot of them wistfully reflect that it would have been nice if they could have gotten a memo that like the revolution isn't happening before they, before they completely and got imprisoned and so forth. But they had a concept, and then in Germany it became like this very intense war with the state apparatus itself. in the name of a larger anti-imperialist framework. But for years and years and years, their conduct was mostly aimed at the criminal justice system and the police apparatus. And Palestine and Vietnam, it became kind of these sort of vague abstractions, and the struggle became very internal to sort of German politics, the German psyche, and detached from the kind of world-saving idealism that propelled them, early in the 60s. Other comments, responses, questions, please?
What are the parallels with what's going on today? The cartoonish ideologues in the bunker with dwindling numbers, fighting a futile fight seem to be the right way. Republican Party, Timothy McVeigh's, the Sharon's and Second Amendment solutions.
I mean, I wish they were cowering in a bunker somewhere,
Can you,
Romney got 49.
can you repeat the question back? I'm sorry.
Yeah, we couldn't hear him at all.
What are the parallels with today? The only people who are stuck in a bunker pursuing a futile vision of armed conflict, although it has not yet become actually violent, heart-shaped to McVeigh, are the right wing, the reactionary.
We still can't hear.
Right. Do you want to summarize that?
That the right wing is a parallel to there's a level of Weatherman crazy intensity that you see in the right wing more than the left wing today.
McVeigh,
I mean, McVeigh was already a while ago. But yeah, I mean, when John Kennedy went to Texas and got killed, first the governor said, you just entered nut country. And then, there's a lot of nuts in America.
Yeah.
And then, I think extremism, is stronger, on the right. And then, I was part of Occupy, and then kind of at the fringes, there is a fascination with violence. I mean, the police marches are like little after images of the days of rage. And I have like students and friends and comrades who have serious discussions about violence against property and are, very much in favor of armed struggle as they witness it elsewhere in the world. And we have sort of fierce debates as to, how useful any of that could be in the domestic, context. And there's deep ideological divisions in the Occupy movement around this question of Graeber versus, forgetting his whatever, sort of ideological Occupy Wall Street. So, anytime like radicals in America are re-energized, these questions come up. And I think what you said from Harry Mackinger is kind of instructive. Like, it can be very easy to romanticize this all. And then coming in, I thought that was going to generally be the tenor of the play. And I thought it was actually a little harsh towards them. I mean, that they seem, I wrote down a series of adjectives. that I like deranged, self-righteous, bombastic, humorless, delusional, narcissistic, a little scared, deeply dogmatic, trapped in an agony of their own doing, capable of thinking only slogan. Right.
We have justified all of those things.
And then, so I found it to, and then at their worst, like they were all of those things.
Right.
But there was also like a pathos and an emotional depth and an intelligence that they had never quite abandoned that was present in all of that. And one thing that's so neat about the movie, Weather Underground by Sam Green, is that these were sort of, kind of half-cocked teenagers with guns, and when you listen to them reflecting on it all, some of these people are fiercely eloquent. And then all the ones I've met are like extremely intelligent people who kind of turn themselves deliberately into, sort of revolutionary robots. And then I felt like there was so much like pathos and humanity that the cast brought to the play.
And we're just college kids.
Right. But the characters, seemed sort of profoundly unlikable. And it was almost like a play without a protagonist. I mean, I thought the most sympathetic, the ingenue was kind of charming, but yeah, you mustache guy, you look like 60s, by the way. And it was the one, because of the Vietnam piece and then the little, thing in the end. But, so for me, the weird tension in the play is that, like, you guys saw something deeply engaging about these characters. or this whole history. And a lot of that was articulated in your little monologues, but that feeling didn't necessarily emanate like from the dialogue and staging itself. And it was kind of like two plays in one. One was about the moral and intellectual journey of the company that put it on, and another was about the history. And then at some level that doubling is precisely what makes it so fascinating. But I wonder if you could take the spirit of those things that folks said and have that sort of emanate from the play itself, so it didn't have to be articulated as a kind of reflexive meta-commentary on the play itself, even though I love those bits. And the Vietnam one, who wrote the Vietnam one? That was really moving, you know, and then what are you doing here? Because that goes back to what were the Americans doing there in the 60s. And then who did the one where you quoted the novella? Right, and then that one which says, you know, if violence ends up in nothing, is it worth doing, right? And then he says, nothing is worth doing, which is a double entendre. Like, let's do violence, because nothing is worth doing, and you can also say, nothing is worth doing. It's like, whoa. You know, I mean, so you captured, like, nihilism and the kind of apocalypticism that was sort of part of it, too. And I think they, you know, they were caught in the oscillations of those, you know, two meanings. I mean, all of the little soliloquies were lovely. I mean, I should say that they didn't like Bobby Kennedy or Martin Luther King. You know? Like one Weatherman, yeah, like...
And you didn't give Dion credit.
What's that?
You didn't give Dion credit.
Right, like, you know, Bobby Kennedy was shot, and then at around the same time, Jerry Rubin, a hippie leader, had a little hairline fracture in his vertebra. And one of the weathermen who I interviewed made this speech at one point saying that he cares more about the hairline fracture in Jerry Rubin's back than he does the spilled brains of Bobby Kennedy. And then some like guy on the left at the rally said he was so shocked he vomited hearing him say that. And it's this book called The Strawberry Statement, whatever. I mean, so they were so anti-liberal that Martin Luther King was nothing but a Uncle Tom and lackey of the system, and Bobby Kennedy was just, you know, the liberal face of fascism, and in retrospect, they feel enormously different. And they will all count.
That's a long left-wing tradition.
Huh? Yeah.
They didn't invent it.
Right, no, you know, of course. I mean, social democracy is a form of social fascism, and this goes back to, you know, whatever International was saying that the New Deal is, you know, a crazy capitalist plot, whatever. You know, so that's, you know, you guys, you know, as you said, like entered into that mental vocabulary, and it's a hard one to, it's so harsh, you know, and yet it's coming from such a place of like love and a desire for a better world. It's just terrible mindfuck, right? Yeah. Any other questions? Comments? Yep.
Just, you know, a lot of the discussion hinges on the dichotomy between violence and nonviolent action in, you know, in thinking of some way to transcend that dichotomy. I don't have any great answers, but I mean, for me, the revolts that have swept around the Arab Spring and more recently in Europe and all, but I think I was fascinated by the you know, the reports and the video coming out of Tahrir Square in Cairo, you know, which was immense mass action, people who struggled as much as they could to keep things nonviolent, and then were attacked, had to become violent to defend the space that they had, but didn't respond in any outward aggressive, you know, way. They defended what they had beautifully against, you know, Mubarak's thugs and all, and then went back to trying to create a nonviolent participatory
I mean, there are these inspiring moments in history. And then another thing that was striking me about the whole evening is, you know, the things that the audience wrote at the end were beautiful. And it seems like, you know, it's not an identical dream, but kind of a shared dream. And we're all sort of speaking, you know, from the same place. And then why is it? And you could find, you know, 1,000 groups of 50 people in New York tonight who have all those dreams. And then why do we do so little, you know, in contrast to the Egyptians, to make it the America of the world that we want it to be? It's inspiring as Occupy Wall Street, because, you know, even that has kind of come and gone, and then there still is some disconnect between hopes, dreams, belief, and then commitment and knowledge of how you actually, you know, make social change. So when I teach about the Weathermen, I want people to become like more inspired about being a public agent of justice work, while equipped with a sense of caution about how you can lose your mind, you know, and then like the best result of the play would be, you know, tomorrow everybody thinks, what can I do to make the world better?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I'm sure you all in your lives already are sort of like doing stuff, but it's like, why can we say all these lovely things on a piece of paper? But please.
I think part of the difference between Egypt and here
We have
is
time for this one last question.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah.
No, do it.
I think in general, I think half the population of Egypt lives on $1 or less a day. So people have little to nothing to lose there, and maybe a lot more to gain by a struggle, which I think is probably one of the biggest impediments to any kind of real. People have it relatively good. I mean, you know, I realize there's a whole slot, but I think that's a big part of it.
Look, I mean, I think you're like fundamentally right. And then, I mean, I took what meant their word, that this was to create a revolution. Yeah. And then I was almost angry at them. You know, it didn't work, guys. They lied to the movement and each other. Because it didn't work. And then, you know, why didn't it work? And I think like what they were selling, the destruction of America, like most Americans like weren't buying. Why? Because like most people have enough access to a modest version of the American dream to feel more invested in the maintenance of the status quo with some modest reform, you know, over some kind of process of social dissolution on the promise of recreating, you know, something better. And in a weird way, like the historic achievement of capitalism at satisfying the core material demands of socialism is the biggest barrier to the advent of socialism in a society like this. And then that's the difficulty of being a revolutionary in a reasonably but insufficiently democratic and affluent, albeit unequal society. And they could never really jump that shadow to get the American masses to take down a society in which, in relative terms, people prosper. And I think, you know, when the viability of the middle class is thrown into question, like we don't even talk about poor people anymore in America. Not at all.
You're right.
Yeah, at all.
Right.
But like when the middle
Ridiculous.
class is
Everything's
facing
middle
declining
class.
social mobility, boy, then we have a problem. Yeah, and then, you know, it's great that there's recognition of how sort of zombie capitalism and, you know, the rich get richer and all this stuff. But, you know, I don't even know what scale of social change, you know, we're even really kind of talking about these days. And then, you know, I'm glad Obama got elected, but like his commitment to fairness is to try to get Congress to, you know, restore 39% tax rate on people earning over $250,000. Like, this is so woefully inadequate as a way to address social inequality. And like Occupy Wall Street helped Obama get elected because fairness focus grouped well, you know? And then he ran on the fairness card. And then what's fairness? Like in these fiscal cliff negotiations, you know, a modest return to the Clinton era tax rates for the like super wealthy. So I feel like there's problems for which there's no solution. We're not even asking the right questions. And then Weatherman's like way in the distance if things really get hot and heavy, but hopefully we can do a better job. Thank you.
Thanks so much.